So now it's time for us to start giving this project a little bit more of life, and we're gonna do that using particles, sounds, and animations. Not in this particular order, but we're gonna start with the particles in this lecture. So first of all, we need to create the particles that we're gonna be using, and you probably still have a little bit of memory about those particles that you've seen in the demo that was presented in the first lecture. So you can probably remember what it was all about, and we will need two particles. We'll need one particle for when the apple hits our leaves bush, and we will need another particle for when the apple hits the blocks, which you can only see when you hit play. So let's start by creating the particles that will be released when we hit the leaves bush. So the sprite that we'll be using for that is in game, and it's called the leaf particles. And to create a particle system that will actually instantiate a lot of these particles at the same time, or with a space timing, we need to create a particle system. So go on game object and particle system. There's no such thing as a particle system 2D, but a particle system works just great in 2D and 3D. You just need to set up a few things depending on the behavior you're trying to achieve. In our case, we don't have to set up much for it to work in 2D because it sort of already works fine. Let's just see where it is. You can see that if I zoom in too close, it doesn't appear. So if I zoom out, it shows. So we know that if I disable the 2D option here, you can see that this is a layered scenario. And if I bring this a little bit further on the Z coordinate, you can see that it starts showing because it's now rendered on top of the other stuff. So in case it doesn't show, it might be on the back of all these other layers. So just make sure that you put it on the front, which is negative. This is curious, but so just need to make sure that this is rendering. So I'm gonna set up mine with a -1 position on the Z-axis. Now we can go back to 2D, and there we go. You can see our particles. And if you go down here, there is an option called renderer, and this is where you actually control what are you actually instantiating. So as you can see, there are a lot of these white halos being instantiated at every frame, or a lot of them being instantiated per second. So we need to change this for our leaf particles sprite. So first of all, we need to create a material to hold this information. So I'm going to create a new folder inside my assets folder. I'm going to call it materials. Inside it, I'm going to right click, create material, and I'm going to call it leaves particle. Alright, so to make this a particle, we need to change its shader. So shader is basically how the object gets rendered in the game. So we need to click on the actual shader that we're using. In this case is the standard one, and there's a particular subset called particles. And in this one you have a lot of particles, a lot of shaders, a lot of behaviors in terms of how it displays on screen. And for this case, we're going to be using alpha blended. This works great for us because the other ones, they kind of add to themselves in terms of color, and the alpha blended stays just the same. I'm going to give you an example. So I'm going to choose additive for now, just so you can see how it works. And I'm going to select a texture for it, which is of course our leaf particles. And now I need to say that this particle system is going to use this material as its default particle. So I'm just going to go on rendering here, and for the material I just need to drag my leaves particle here. And you can see that it kind of adds to the background color, and this is a weird behavior. And the one that's going to work great in this case is the alpha blended one. Alright, so this doesn't add, this just renders the particle as they are. Okay, you can also change the tint color. This is going to multiply the color of the particle itself. So this is not required because we can also add a color to each particular leaf. So by clicking on the particle system here, we have a lot of parameters, and I mean it, a lot of parameters that we can control. Let's start by changing the orientation of these particles. So I'm going to go over on start rotation, and I'm going to increase it to maybe 90 degrees or something close, and we can actually randomize between two different constants. So just click on this little down arrow here and choose random between two constants, and now we can pass in two different constants that will randomize between. So maybe 0 and 180. This looks nice, but they aren't falling, so we need to add a gravity modifier. Let's try 1. And as you can see, they are now falling. So the bigger the gravity modifier is, the harder they will fall. So for example, 10, you can barely see them, right? And maybe 0.3, they go even higher because it means that the gravity modifier isn't that big. If you want to have a gravity that works the other way, you can just add a negative number here. So it works as if there's some kind of attraction field on top of the screen here. But in our case, I'm going to try to use maybe 0.7, I guess. And you really have to play around with those parameters because you can do a lot of stuff that's actually really cool. And I'm also going to change the size. So on start size, I'm going to bring this down a little bit. And the speed, I'm going to make it to get a random value between two constants, so I can get a nice variation for the speed. So maybe between 7 and 8 or something. Actually, oops, I'm sorry, I ended up randomizing the lifetime, but I mean the speed. So I'm going to go random between two constants on the speed, between 7 and 8 perhaps. It looks too much. Maybe between 3 and 5, that's too low. 5 and 6. So let's play around with these. We can also change the start color, so this color will also multiply the color of each particle, and this can also be used as a random parameter. So just click on this down arrow, random between two constants, and now we can change perhaps a white color and one that is sort of a reddish color, because it will give this effect of a burnt leaf, which is very cool. And we have this effect on the leaves brush as well, so it kind of adds to the realism, right? Or graphical fidelity. And one other nice thing we can do is we can try to increase the amount of particles that are rendered at each second. So just expand emission here, and you can increase the rate. So the bigger the rate is, the more particles per second will going to be emitted. And I didn't change much here, so I'm going to try 40. That looks like a lot. Maybe 20 looks good. And I'm going to change the lifetime so they die earlier. Maybe 2, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. That looks good. But there's a problem here. You can see that they disappear out of nowhere. They're there, they're looking good, and then they disappear. It would be nice if we have some kind of fade based on their lifetime. So the closer they're getting to their death, we want to fade that. Okay, so we can do that pretty easily. You can just enable here color over lifetime, and then there's a nice curve for you to edit. Actually, a gradient editor. So we'll start out in this point. So this is the starting point, and this is the end point. And for the end point, we have this point up here, and that means the alpha, and the down point here means the color. So for the alpha, I want to bring it down to 0 because I want to fade that away. But I don't want to fade it linearly. I want to have the alpha full set until maybe this point. So I just click here to add a new alpha point, and I can just drag it down if I don't want it anymore. So it's going to delete it. In my case, I'm going to click it here. I'm going to put the alpha back to 255, which is 1. And you can see that they start to fade out when they're getting close to their death. So this looks very, very good. And something that's not cool in this is that they're looping. So we're gonna disable this looping option, and we're gonna press stop and then simulate. So this is actually going to be the simulate we get in real time. But you can see that this is emitting for too long. So we can just change the duration for maybe, 0.5. Oops. And that means that we're gonna emit particles during 0.5 seconds, and then we're gonna stop. Alright, so this is where it gets tricky. This is where we need actually to control the parameters. So I can see that the emission is too low. So I'm gonna increase it by, maybe twice as big. Still doesn't look good. Maybe 100. And this is starting to look nicer. But I want to randomize the speed more as well, because it looks like they are going the same speed. So I'm gonna make this even bigger. Maybe a start speed varying between 7 and 3. Now this is starting to look like a mess, and this is the behavior I want. Maybe not too big, maybe just 6 as the maximum. Alright, and this looks good. We can also add rotation over lifetime, so we can just add this option, rotation over lifetime, expanded. So it means that we're gonna have 45 degrees of angular velocity for each particle. This can of course be randomized. Let's see what we get here. Oh, this is nice. I'm just gonna randomize between minus 45 and 45, so some particles are going to go in the other way. And this looks pretty good. Okay, so this looks good enough, and I'm gonna make a prefab out of this. I'm just gonna change its name. So up here, I'm gonna click on particle system, and I'm gonna change it to leaves bush. Actually, leaves particle. And on the prefabs folder, I'm just gonna drag this, and there you go. We have a prefab. Let's see if it's working. There you go. It's working. Very nice. Gonna delete these. Apply the prefab changes just in case. There you go. So I'm gonna save my scene, save my project, and I'll see you in the next video so we can set up the particles for the block destruction.